Well, that op-ed was published and it garnered attention internationally, worldwide, quite a bit of attention. And what I found was interesting is there have been, since Nagasaki, Hiroshima, at the end of the Second World War, there have been numerous calls, many of them by sitting presidents, to end nuclear weapons. But they've always seemed to evoke a reaction of that's something far in the distant future. It's an ideal. It's a nice thing to talk about. But your call seemed to carry with it a reaction of the possibility of practicality here. And I'm wondering why is that?
Well, I think you are quite right that there have been calls for the elimination of nuclear weapons for decades now. First difference was the Cold War was over. I mean, some of the calls during the Cold War did not get serious attention. The second, and I think this was an important point, was that the four names on that op-ed were all people who had participated in the development the development of the weapons themselves or in the policies controlling those weapons. None of the four could have been considered a idealist. All of them were regarded as pragmatic, practical people. There are serious people who have listened to these arguments and reject them, and I understand that. But they do not, I think, adequately address the issue, and adequately face what I think is a very real prospect that we are drifting towards another drifting towards the use of nuclear weapons, or maybe even a nuclear war. It seems to me that that prospect has gotten more likely each year in the last few decades. So it's not just a matter of a terrorist getting a nuclear bomb, although that's probably the number one worry. But there's also a possibility today of another nuclear war starting. So the probability that happens is not fully recognized or understood by most people, and the horror of such a result is not fully understood by most people. And part of our mission is to try to make people face those two realities. We state in that article, and I firmly believe, that much too emphasis is being put today on the role of nuclear weapons in deterrence. But when you stop to think about how the last 4 or 5 decades have actually transpired, the security issues which we actually faced were issues which nuclear weapons did not deter. They did not deter the Korean War. They did not deter the Vietnam War. From the Soviet Union point of view, they did not deter the ultimate, the collapse of the Soviet Union. The nuclear weapons did not keep that from happening. So on the one hand, I argue, and we argue in that op-ed, that too much weight has been put on the role of nuclear weapons and what they can deter. In the last analysis, they only deterred one thing, which is the U.S. and the Soviet Union from going to war with each other during the Cold War. That was a big achievement.
Right.
But they did not do all the other bad things that happened during that period. And now that there is no Soviet Union, now there's no longer the prospect of a U.S.-Soviet Union confrontation, then it's clearly time to revisit the whole question of deterrence.
Well, the United States and now Russia still maintain by far the largest number of operationally deployed weapons of any country. In fact, I think more than all the other states combined. How does the relationship between the United States and Russia vis-a-vis disarmament and denuclearization affect the conversation worldwide? Or is that relationship still supreme?
It is, and it is absolutely clear. Well, two things I think are clear. First of all is that both the United States and Russia today have many, many more nuclear weapons than can be justified by any basis of national security. So we have argued, and I have argued many times myself, that there should be dramatic reductions in the number of nuclear weapons in the United States and Russia. Secondly, to try to get other nations in the world, particularly the nuclear powers, to participate in this, all of them are holding back to saying, what are the United States and Russia doing? So the United States and Russia must lead in this move towards denuclearization. They must make substantial movements towards decreasing their own nuclear arms.
Are our two countries, the U.S. and now Russia, do we still set that standard? Do we still have the same level, high level of control over these materials and weapons?
I believe that we do. I'm never fully satisfied with those standards, but I would not want to be an alarmist in that respect. I do believe that the standards are very high. I have very little concern about a loss of a nuclear weapon from either the United States or Russia today. But we're not the only nuclear powers. China, of course, has a nuclear arsenal, which, as far as I can tell, also has high standards associated with it. India and Pakistan have probably more than 100 nuclear weapons each, and it continued to build nuclear weapons. Both of those nations, I've discussed this with leaders in both of those nations believe they have good standards. We have no way of being really confident of that. And I am particularly concerned about Pakistan, not because the government does not want to maintain high standards, but because there's some important areas of the Pakistani country which are not really under government control. And some of those areas are quite close to where the nuclear weapons are stored.
What are the similarities, the connections and differences, if any, between the relevant means of halting proliferation when one compares a state actor, a sovereign country, with a secret program from a well-funded terrorist organization, which is a non-state actor? Are they the same problem, or are there differences between them?
No terror group that I know of, no matter how well funded and how well organized, has the capacity themselves to make fissile material. It's a huge industrial undertaking, and it's quite visible ordinarily when it's undertaken. So I do not see a danger of a terror group themselves making a nuclear bomb from scratch. But I think they can readily make a nuclear bomb if they're well organized, well funded, if they can get the fissile material from one of the states that have the capability to make it. So every time a new state becomes part of the nuclear club, becomes capable of making fissile material, that's one more state then that it simply further increases the vulnerability that a terror group will be able to get the fissile material. I want to emphasize again, I do not believe a terror group can by itself build a nuclear bomb from scratch. They had to either buy or steal the bomb, or they had to buy or steal the fissile material.
Well, let's just assume for a moment that despite best efforts, the proliferation of materials and weapons continues and even accelerates. Mm-hmm. Could you describe a world and the relationship between nations if there were 20 or 50 or even 100 declared nuclear entities or credibly suspected nuclear states?
Well, it simply greatly increases the probability the nuclear bomb will be used. Either a terrorist will get a hold of one and use it, or there will be a nuclear war between two states. And that is a catastrophe of a level which most people's mind can't fully encompass. That's why we're trying to prevent it.
As in the Cold War, would there be a risk that that would turn into a global conflagration, or could you foresee that event, that drastic event, happening and still remaining to some degree isolated from the rest of the world?
I can imagine a circumstance in which it does not evolve into a worldwide nuclear conflagration. I cannot imagine a circumstance, though, in which it does not dramatically affect the rest of the world in many ways. The consequence of, let's say, of a nuclear war between two regional powers will be worldwide in its effect, even if it does not spread to a nuclear war. There will be nuclear contamination spread around the atmosphere. There will be social and economic political consequences of it, it will change the world in ways we cannot imagine right now. And all of those changes will be for the worse.
That body of experts, that body of committed leaders with experience who are at the center and command respect that's broad, hasn't changed much since the Cold War. Is there a new generation coming up to take on this work and eventually lead it, or are we going to be lacking in that regard going forward?
You know, on the one hand, I'm pessimistic on that issue. On the other hand, I have some optimism. The pessimism stems from the general political climate in the United States today. That has nothing to do with this issue we're talking about. But we have become politically so polarized in our country today that it's hard to imagine any issue being regarded on a truly nonpartisan basis. It's hard to imagine even the most important national security issues where the politics stops at the edge of the water. So the tradition, which really was substantially well followed during the Cold War, I think has drifted away. And we're now in a political environment where almost no issue seems to be able to be tackled on a nonpartisan basis. And I think that's really quite sad. That's my negative answer to your question. The positive answer is that I work here at Stanford and other universities with young people, both as students and as the young professors around here. And I see a new generation coming along, which seem to me to be much more serious about these issues, much better informed about them. And I do have hopes that we'll see a more serious approach to our national security issues in the future than we're seeing today.
And I'm wondering if you could share, if you could, your vision of what that means, what a world without nuclear weapons would be like, not just at the macro sense between nations, but at the level of people, nations, cultures, individuals.
And the world we are looking to has to have some international way of dealing with conflict that focuses on preventing the conflict in the first place, dealing with the causes of conflict. We are very far from that world today. And as long as we have major conflicts in the world, and as long as we have major wars occurring regionally, then people are going to be motivated to try to get the most powerful weapons they can, including nuclear weapons. And we cannot repeal E equals mc squared. We cannot uninvent the nuclear bomb. So if people are fighting wars, believe they need to have more and more powerful weapons, and the knowledge of the bomb is out there, there will always be a motivation to build nuclear bombs. So we have to find a way of dealing with that problem. The world we live in today would be a dangerous world even without nuclear weapons. And without nuclear weapons, there would be a huge impetus for people to rebuild them. So we have to deal with those problems. So that's what we mean when we say it's not just a world without, today's world without nuclear weapons. That doesn't work.
For the readers of this article and the viewers of our conversation today, who perhaps want to know more about this issue, want to find out more about it, and maybe engage in the larger conversation, do you have any recommendations for them about how they might do that?
Yes, I do. We have, as you well know, produced a DVD called The Nuclear Tipping Point. It describes both the dangers of nuclear weapons and describes some steps that can be taken to try to deal with those dangers. All of those steps require political action. They require governments being motivated to take those actions. And in a democracy, that requires people understanding the problems and wanting to act on them. So we have to inform people. huge task in front of us today is an education task. This DVD is an attempt to try to deal with that problem, but it has to be seen by people and it has to be discussed by people. So what I would recommend, anybody who really cares about this problem, is get a copy of this DVD, which is cheap. You can get it by just sending to, I mean, it's free. You just get it by sending to nti.org and asking for it. Play it yourself. Invite a dozen friends to your house and play it for them and discuss it. The discussion is more important even than the watching of it. But if we have neighborhood groups all over Palo Alto and all over California and all over the United States meeting and discussing these issues, then that provides the body of knowledge which in a democracy will lead our politicians to care about the problem and take actions about the problem. That only deals with the problem in the United States. But in this problem, the leadership must come from the United States. If we do not lead on this problem, nothing will happen.